The letter arrived just as the storm rolled in, a jagged streak of lightning splitting the night as a feral wind battered the windows of my tiny flat. It wasn't delivered by post, nor had it been left by a neighbor. When I opened the door to the sudden knock, no one was there. Only the letter, perched on the threshold like a hunter's trap. It was an unassuming thing at first glance, folded neatly with a seal of black wax. The insignia etched into the wax, a crescent moon encircled by thorned vines, was unfamiliar. Something about it made me hesitate, my hand hovering above the paper as though it might burn me. But curiosity won. It always did. Inside, written in dark, looping ink, was a single line. Midnight awaits you at the Hollow Inn. No name, no explanation. The words seemed to pulse on the page, as though they were alive, and the longer I stared, the more the air around me felt oppressive. My mind raced. The Hollow Inn, a name I hadn't heard in years, its mention tucked away in the murky whispers of local lore. The Hollow Inn was infamous in our town, a derelict husk of a building that sat on the outskirts of civilization, where the forest swallowed the light and the roads twisted like veins. Abandoned decades ago after a string of disappearances, it had become the sort of place people talked about only in hushed tones, claiming it was haunted or cursed. It's a prank, I thought. It had to be. But there was something about the letter, the weight of the words, that made it impossible to dismiss. By the time the storm subsided, I was already pulling on my coat, the letter crumpled in my fist. The drive to the Hollow Inn was an exercise in paranoia. The roads were slick with rain, my headlights catching fleeting glimpses of gnarled trees that clawed at the sky. The radio hissed with static, and every so often, I thought I saw movement in the rearview mirror, shadows darting just out of view. By the time I arrived, my nerves were taut, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn back. But the inn loomed before me, impossible to ignore. It was a crumbling beast of a building, its spires jagged and broken, its windows black and hollow. Moonlight filtered through the thick clouds above, casting an eerie glow over the warped wood and ivy-choked stone. The front door stood ajar, as though inviting me in. I wasn't alone. 2 cars were parked haphazardly in the gravel lot, their windows fogged. My pulse quickened at the thought of other people, some shared insanity pulling them to this place like me. As I approached the door, a distant clock struck 12, its chime resonating through the night like a warning. Inside, the air was thick with decay, the faint scent of mildew mingling with something metallic. A single chandelier hung above the grand entrance, its broken crystals refracting light from the candles flickering below. The shadows danced, stretching long and unnatural across the faded wallpaper. At the center of the room was a man. He stood with his back to me, impossibly tall, his frame cloaked in a tattered coat that seemed to drink in the light. His wide-brimmed hat obscured his face, but his voice, deep and resonant, filled the space when he spoke. "You are late," he said without turning. My throat tightened, but before I could respond, he gestured toward a door leading deeper into the inn. "Join us." The room he led me to was a tableau of dread. A long oaken table stretched across its center, scarred and stained by time. 4 chairs surrounded it, their upholstery faded to a sickly gray. At each place was an antique card, face down, and a pair of dice carved from something that gleamed like bone. The walls were adorned with grotesque murals, depictions of shadowed figures and leering faces, their eyes painted so vividly they seemed to follow my every move. 3 others were already seated. A woman in her 40s, her sharp features marred by unease, a young man barely out of his teens, his leg bouncing nervously under the table, and a burly man with a face like stone, his expression unreadable. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The fear in their eyes mirrored my own. The man in the hat, the midnight visitor, as I would come to think of him, took his place at the head of the table. He removed his hat, revealing a face that seemed carved from shadow. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, their amber hue both mesmerizing and terrifying. "This is a game," he began, his voice weaving through the room like smoke. "The rules are simple. Each of you will take turns, a roll of the dice, a draw of the card, and the game will reveal what it must. To win, you must survive." The young man swallowed hard. "And if we lose?" The visitor smiled, a thin, cruel smile that turned my stomach. "Losing is worse than death." The room seemed to darken as he spoke. Shadows writhed along the walls, and the faint sound of whispers filled the air, incomprehensible but suffused with malice. I wanted to run, to bolt for the door, and never look back, but my body refused to move. The visitor reached beneath the table, producing a book bound in cracked leather. He opened it, its pages filled with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse. "Let us begin," he said. The candlelight flickered, and the game began. The first roll of the dice was mine. The dice felt cold and heavy in my hand, their surface unnervingly smooth, except for the faint etchings of unfamiliar symbols on each face. They weren't numbers, at least not any numbers I recognized. With trembling fingers, I released them onto the table. They clattered against the wood, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The dice landed on a symbol, a jagged spiral intertwined with a staring eye. The visitor leaned forward, his shadow stretching impossibly far across the table as he revealed the card before me. It was blank at first, the surface unmarred. Then, as if alive, the card began to darken. A shape bled through the blankness, spreading like ink in water until it resolved into an image. A man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss that stared back. Beneath it, written in looping, spidery script, were the words, "The Betrayal." The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. My vision blurred as a memory, unbidden and unwanted, rose to the surface. I was back in college, standing in a dimly lit dorm hallway, my hands shaking as I shoved a key into my friend Marcus's door. I knew he was inside, knew he was alone. I also knew that the people I'd sold him out to were waiting in the stairwell. The promise of money and power had clouded my judgment, and when the door finally opened, Marcus looked at me with confusion and trust. That trust shattered when the men burst in. I felt the betrayal again, as though it was fresh, sharp, and searing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as Marcus's screams filled my ears, followed by a silence more suffocating than the guilt that had haunted me since. The vision faded, and I was back at the table. My hands gripped the edge so tightly my knuckles were white. The others were staring at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. "You see," the visitor said, his voice a purr of malice, "the game reveals truth. It draws from the depths of who you are, and the deeper the wound, the sharper the blade." I wanted to scream, to throw the table over and run, but something kept me rooted in place. Perhaps it was the knowledge that I couldn't leave. None of us could. The others took their turns, each roll of the dice unspooling their secrets. The woman, her name was Andrea, rolled next. Her card revealed an image of a child curled in a corner, their shadow overtaken by an enormous, monstrous hand. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered about a little girl, her daughter, who had disappeared from a playground years ago while Andrea had been too engrossed in her phone to notice. The young man, Sam, rolled after her. His card showed a forest ablaze, a figure watching from the shadows as animals fled the inferno. His face twisted as he muttered about a campfire he'd left unattended during a dry season, and the forest fire that followed, consuming homes and lives. Each revelation seemed to feed the visitor, His shadow grew darker, his eyes brighter, and the room colder. The final roll belonged to the burly man, Greg. His card revealed a noose swinging in an empty room. Unlike the others, he said nothing, his jaw clenched tight, but the grief in his eyes spoke volumes. By the time the first round ended, none of us were the same. The game had stripped us bare, exposing the worst parts of ourselves, and yet the visitor's hunger wasn't sated. "The stakes rise with each round," he said, his voice echoing like a death knell. "You may survive the first, but can you endure what's to come?" Andrea didn't survive the second round. Her roll of the dice seemed innocuous enough, landing on a symbol of interlocking chains. Her card depicted a woman chained to a crumbling pillar, her face contorted in anguish. "The price for your negligence," the visitor intoned, "is greater than guilt." Andrea clutched her chest, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and suddenly, chains of black iron coiled out of the shadows, wrapping around her wrists and ankles. She screamed as they pulled taut, dragging her back into the dark corner of the room. Her eyes locked on mine as she vanished, her scream abruptly cut off. The room was silent, save for the soft rattle of the dice in Sam's trembling hands. None of us dared to speak. When Sam rolled, his card showed a door ajar, the glow of flames visible through the crack. "Face your fire," the visitor whispered. Sam's chair burst into flames, the fire spreading across his body faster than it should have been possible. He shrieked, clawing at himself, but the flames devoured him silently, leaving nothing behind but his scorched seat. Greg and I were all that remained. My roll came next, the dice tumbling onto the same spiral eye symbol as before. My card revealed a mirror, cracked and splintering, reflecting not my face but Marcus's. The visitor's smile widened. "You will face him," he said, and the room shifted. I found myself standing in Marcus's dorm, the sound of footsteps behind me growing louder. I turned to find Marcus there, his face twisted in rage, blood pouring from wounds I couldn't explain. He lunged at me, his hands cold and clawing, and for the first time, I fought back, screaming as I wrestled with the weight of my past. When the vision broke, I was back at the table, my body trembling. Greg glared at me, as though my survival had cost him dearly. The visitor turned to him, his smile cold. "It is time to choose, Gregory." Greg rose, his fists clenched, but instead of rolling the dice, he grabbed the table, flipping it with a roar. "No more games." The visitor simply laughed, his form growing darker and less human. "The game is eternal. Defiance changes nothing." As the shadows surged, I realized the final round had already begun. Greg's defiance shattered the fragile balance of the game. The overturned table skidded across the warped floor, its cards and dice spilling like entrails. The visitor stood, his tall frame elongating, twisting as if his very essence bent reality. His shadow spread like spilled ink, climbing the walls, choking the air. "You misunderstand, Gregory," the visitor hissed, his voice layered with a sinister echo. "The rules are not so easily broken. You either play, or you pay." Greg lunged, his broad shoulders barreling toward the visitor, fire blazing in his eyes. But as he neared, his movements faltered, slowed. The air around the visitor shimmered, thick and suffocating, like invisible chains had seized Greg mid-stride. He strained, his muscles taut, veins bulging, but he could go no further. The visitor raised a single finger, and Greg crumpled to the ground, writhing in agony. His screams tore through the room, a sound so raw it felt alive, scraping against my skull. From the corner of my eye, I saw the shadows slither toward him, curling around his limbs like predatory vines. I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the floor, my breath shallow as the scene unfolded. "You've forfeited your turn," the visitor said, his tone almost amused. "And so, your soul is mine." The shadows dragged Greg into the darkness, his screams growing faint, then falling silent. The black void that swallowed him pulsed, a sickening rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. When the shadows receded, Greg was gone, and the visitor turned to me. "Your turn," he said simply, his grin widening to an impossible degree. The cards had returned to the table, impossibly pristine despite the chaos. The dice lay waiting in front of me, their symbols glinting faintly in the flickering candlelight. My fingers trembled as I reached for them. There was no choice. The dice were cold as death in my palm, their weight heavier than before. I cast them, their clatter reverberating unnaturally in the still room. They landed on two symbols, a shattered crown and a hand clutching a dagger. The visitor revealed my card. It depicted me, or what was left of me, standing in a desolate field, surrounded by faceless figures whose outstretched hands reached for pieces of my body. My limbs, my flesh, even my shadow were being ripped away, consumed by their hunger. The inscription read, "The cost of defiance." The room shifted. I was no longer seated at the table. I stood in the field from the card, the air thick with ash and the stench of decay. The figures surrounded me, their hollow eyes burning like embers. They advanced, their movements jerky, inhuman, their fingers grasping for me. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me turned to mire, sucking at my feet, slowing my every step. Their hands found me, cold, skeletal, unyielding. They pulled at my flesh, my thoughts, my very essence. I felt myself unraveling, pieces of me being taken, devoured. "No," I screamed, thrashing against the faceless horde. My voice echoed in the void, but there was no one to hear it. "Stop." The single word pierced the chaos. The figures halted, their grasp loosening. The visitor stood before me now, his form immense and otherworldly, his eyes twin suns of malice. "You cling to life, yet you know its cost," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "You wish to survive? Then prove your worth." A blade materialized in his hand, its edge gleaming with an unholy light. He offered it to me. "Take it. Sacrifice the part of you that defied. Leave it behind, and you may go." I hesitated, staring at the blade. The figures began to stir again, their hands twitching, eager. The mire around me deepened. I grasped the blade. The act felt like severing a piece of my soul. My defiance, my pride, manifested in my mind as a tangible thing, a part of me that I had carried my whole life. With shaking hands, I drove the blade into that piece, cutting it away. The figures dissipated, fading into the void. The mire receded. I collapsed, gasping for air. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the inn, alone. The visitor and the others were gone. The table was bare, the room silent. I stumbled outside, the cold night air sharp against my skin. The world felt different, emptier. A fragment of myself was missing, a void I knew would never be filled. As I walked away, the sound of a clock striking midnight echoed faintly behind me, and the visitor's final words whispered in my mind, "Midnight is eternal. We will play again."